Gwen, whenever you're ready, we're ready on this side. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're scheduled for a 12:30 start time, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, all right. We will just sit tight till 12:30, but thanks for letting me know everything's good. Okay, if people want to turn their cameras on, we will get going with our administration and finance meeting. And I will note, I'll call us to order, and I will note that this is a virtual meeting, so people can access us via the web by going to our city website and the agenda and finding the link there. They can also leave City Council a voicemail at 552-6012, and they can always email City Council, council@ci.missoula.mt.us. So thank you for noting that documentation up there, Lisa. And let me pull up my agenda. Here we go. If we could do a roll call vote, that would be helpful. Thank you. Lisa, do you hear me? Yeah, I think, Lisa, you're muted. I'm not hearing anything.
Okay, sometimes the space bar works, sometimes not. Let's try this again. Good morning, everybody. Stacy Anderson.
Present.
Martha Becerra.
Present.
John Contos.
Here.
Heather Harp.
Present.
Jordan Hess.
Present.
Gwen Jones.
Present.
Julie Merritt. Looks like Julie's here today. Jesse Ramos.
Present.
Amber Sherrill.
Present.
Sandra Vasica.
Present.
Brian Von Lossberg.
Here.
Heidi West.
Present.
And Julie Merritt.
Present.
All right, thank you. Everyone's here.
Great. We have a full house. Thank you. We have minutes from April 7th, 2019. That was last week. Did anyone have any changes to those minutes? Seeing none. Seeing none, those will stand approved. We will take public comment on items not on the agenda. We have one person who is attending. If you'd like to raise your hand if you want to comment. I'm not seeing a raised hand, so we'll go forward with the meeting. We have one item on our agenda today. It is the FY 2020 audit presentation. Lee Griffin, our finance director, is here to present on that, and she'll introduce Jan Schweitzer, who I believe is doing it again this year. So I think we've all sat through these in the past. This is always a good check-in on a yearly basis on the financial health, how everything's going with the city in terms of our audit. So Lee, are you in the meeting?
I am. And I'm going to have to ask everybody for just a moment. We're having a bit of a technical difficulty getting Jan in to the meeting. So we've been rushedly sending links and so forth back and forth. So if we could hold on for just a moment, I'm going to go back. I'm going to click off camera and go check in with that and make sure that we can get her on here. And then she will have a presentation to share.
Great. I tell you what, we will just briefly adjourn until Lisa tells me that we need to start the meeting again. So no pressure. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll just adjourn for a minute. Okay, everyone?
Hi, Lee. All right, it looks like Jan was able to join, so we're ready to go.
Great. Well, Jan is here, so we'll get the party started. We will be back in session here. And I was just saying that we're having our FY 2020 audit presentation. And Lee, if you want to speak to that and then introduce Jan, that would be great.
Thank you, Gwen. So this audit presentation is a presentation on the audit that we did for fiscal and the year ending January 30th, 2020. That's fiscal year 20. So this is a bit in the past. And I want to let folks know that this is a very high level presentation that we received from Anderson Zermulin. So we're not going to have a lot of the detail about why a fund might have changed by a relatively small amount. I'm just prefacing that to let City Council know if anyone would like a follow-up ANF committee to get into some of the details about the changes that have occurred, that is absolutely something that we can schedule. But in the meantime, we have this presentation from Anderson Zermulin. They have been our auditors for a handful of years now. And Jan will tell you about the auditing procedures that they go through to ensure that our published financial statements conform in all respects and are free from error. And so with that being said, Jan, I believe you have the ability to share your screen. And thank you for joining us today.
Looks like it. Can everybody hear me okay? It's always
Yes.
stressful when, you know, the technology, like it just doesn't seem to work at the very beginning of a meeting, but it is what it is. So we're here together. So thank you for your patience. I appreciate it. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here. So hopefully you can all see the PowerPoint presentation. Is that correct? Okay, perfect. All right, well, thank you. As you can see here, this is for the year ended June 30th, 2020. So we're almost at your next fiscal year end, which is unbelievable. How time goes so quickly. You know, we wanted time to pass quickly this year, but we didn't anticipate it being this quick. So with that, we'll just go ahead and get into the presentation. So here, what I wanted to show you here is just the presentation outline. We're going to be talking about all of these things as we go through in terms of the acknowledgements. I really wanted to thank Lee and Jesse and everybody at the city. It was a trying year. This year was a bit different. Obviously, we weren't able to be on site as much as we normally are. The normal process of an audit is we spend quite a bit of time on site looking at documentation, talking to people in person in that field work phase, but we had to turn that all into remote procedures. And so the staff at the city was very good about being able to pivot from that electronic piece that was present there. So we conducted all of our audit meetings over Zoom. So it's the next best thing to, being in person and being able to actually see face to face that person that we're talking to. So all in all, I feel that it went pretty smoothly. I don't know how Lee and those folks feel, but from our presentation or from our purposes, it went as smoothly as it possibly could. So getting into the audit scope, we'll talk a little bit about this. And the scope overall of the audit this year was unchanged from the prior year, and we haven't changed the scope itself in several years. And what that means is there's various auditing standards that we have to comply with, and those are all up here depending on what type of an audit it is. We have to always follow our auditing standards. Since this is a local government entity, we also have additional auditing standards that apply specifically to those types of entities. And then since there's always federal funds involved, we are also subject to single audit compliance requirements under the uniform guidance. And in fiscal year 20, speaking of those, the city expended approximately $8.2 million in 2020 of federal funds. And that was up quite a bit from 2019. And it was due primarily to funding received as part of the coronavirus relief funds. There were significant funds received for those. Expenditures for those during 2020 were about $4.5 million. Other grant funding programs, in terms of the programs themselves, were pretty consistent with prior years, but depending on the activity for those grants, sorry, I need to get to that next slide. I've got two screens going on here. But depending on activity for those other grants, expenditures will vary each year. And so the other part of the scope of the audit is that the audit overall includes all city funds as well as the 4 component units. We do issue separate audit reports for MRA and MPC, Missoula Redevelopment Agency, and Missoula Parking Commission. So we don't necessarily incorporate our procedures in conjunction with the city audit when we're doing the city audit itself. But for BID and TBID, we don't issue separate audit reports for those. So we actually include and incorporate all of our testing procedures while we're doing the city audit. And those are presented as discretely presented component units. And I'll be providing an overview later as it relates to those entities as well. As far as the city's major funds for 2020, they were the general fund, which is always a major fund, the wastewater or sewer fund, and the water fund, very, very similar to the prior year. And when we talk about the major funds, what we do is we incorporate additional testing, kind of extended procedures on the major funds that each year as we determine those. And those are also presented separately in their own discrete columns in the overall audit report. All right, so summary of audit results. This is the best part. So you can see here that the summary of the audit results resulted in an unmodified opinion on the financial statements, which is the best opinion you can get. We identified no findings over major federal programs and no findings over financial reporting. And for 2020, the major programs were the Coronavirus Relief Fund and the Brownfield grants, which we haven't tested in quite a few years. So it's always interesting to see how those cycle through in terms of what's going to be tested each year. And it was an interesting process for the coronavirus funds, and I don't know if Lee would call it interesting, but as we found, there wasn't a lot of solid guidance throughout the audit period that we were looking at. Everything, as with all the other CARES Act funds and all the coronavirus relief funds, all of the laws and regulations just seem to fluctuate and were never really finalized until the very last minute. And so some of the final guidance that we needed for our audit procedures weren't really issued until late December. And so that it was just really an interesting process. But in general, we got through it okay and everything was fine. So we're good there. All right, let's see. Financial statement highlights. So this is where I'm going to go through and just review with you various financial statement highlights. So it's going to be very high level. And this information comes from the financial information and the stat section of the annual report, what we otherwise refer to as the CAFR. As a preface to these slides, I like to always remind you that the city's financial statements are presented in two different ways. First, there's the government-wide statements that present the city's financial condition and operating results on a full accrual basis without regard to funds. So this presentation is meant in a lot of ways to be very similar to what a nonprofit organization or a commercial entity would report in the form of a balance sheet and an income statement, basically, that takes into consideration debt and fixed assets and all of those things that you don't see on the normal fund accounting level. And the second set of financial statements, of course, is on the traditional fund basis of accounting, with major funds presented separately, as I already described, and then all other funds are kind of combined. And supplementary data in the annual report shows information for all of those funds by fund. So for the special revenue, it will combine all of the individual funds, and that will roll up to the total. And so it's kind of a ladder process, if you will, as you're looking through those statements. So these slides that we're going to be going through present the city's financial information only. It does not include the component units. So I just wanted to make sure that we're all aware of that. And I also always like to encourage you to read through the management's discussion and analysis in the combined annual financial report. It gives a very good comprehensive review that the staff put together and puts things into a lot of easier to digest, if you will, context than reading through the 350-page report itself. So that's a really good overview for folks to get an idea of what's going on in the city. So with that, we'll start talking about individual categories of the financial statements. And this first slide shows the city's net position, in other words, equity position for the past 6 years. This is shown on the full accrual basis of accounting. And so what that means is that capital assets, including infrastructure, net of depreciation, debt, all of those types of things are included in these numbers here. You can see from this slide, 2020 is over at the very end on the right, and net position increased by about $2 million overall. And most times the changes are related to activity in capital assets, grant activity, which is the case this year. It should be noted that this depicts all city funds, government, and enterprise, not just the general fund. So you can kind of see from this particular graph that it really did do a good job of depicting this. And this comes from page 23 in the annual report. As far as fund balances go, this particular slide shows fund balances on the traditional fund accounting model for the past 6 years, broken out by general fund and all other funds. You can see the overall increase in the fund balances over this time frame as well. So in 2020, total fund balances increased quite a bit. This increase is due to a combination of factors, including an increase in property tax revenues as a result of an increase in taxable values, and activity related to the timing of the receipt of grant funds. Moving on to fund revenues, here we can see the breakdown of the city's revenues in its fund financial statements. So this is broken out by general fund and other funds, again, over the past 6 years. Just as a reminder, these are governmental funds only on this particular slide, and includes not only the general fund, but special revenue, debt service, and capital projects funds. The revenues used in this graph do not include other financing sources such as transfers in or issuances of debt, because those can really vary from year to year, and it's really hard when those numbers skew the general trends of everything else going on. Property taxes, of course, provide the main base for general government operations. Those are also supplemented by other sources of revenue such as state shared revenues, interest, and other sources. So general fund revenues in total increased when compared to the prior year by about 16%. Primarily, this is due to an increase in taxes and assessments, intergovernmental revenue. Revenues for all other funds increased by about 17%, including increases in intergovernmental revenues and licenses of permits. From the fund expenditures standpoint, again, broken out by general fund and all other funds over the past 6 years. Again, we don't include other financing uses such as transfers out, primarily since those can vary so much year to year and again, skew the results that we would typically see. Total expenses in 2020 in the general fund increased about 7%, primarily in public safety and general government expenditures, which can largely be attributed to the grant funding that was received. And the change in all other funds was an increase of about 14%. And the biggest changes there were in culture and recreation and public works. Mill levies, this is always a good graph to see. This graph shows the mill levies over the past 6 years. This year, there was a decrease in overall mills. Specifically in city mills and school mills. Counties remained essentially flat. All the other categories actually remained essentially flat. So overall, the total mills, you can see here from this graph, decreased a little over 2.5% from the prior year. And then taxable values, you can see here from this slide, the change in taxable values for the city over the past 6 years. And you can see that it really increased this year quite a bit over the prior year, very evident in this graph. So, you know, again, property tax revenues are tied to this as well. So you would expect to see if property tax revenues went up, it's correlated with the taxable values of the property. Okay, so this next slide we always like to show, or I always like to show, this is the debt margin calculation, and I like to put this into a little bit of context before we get into the actual graph. But so state statute actually sets the legal debt limit that the city is subject to at 2.5% of the total assessed value of taxable property. So the margin, that kind of gap where you can borrow, will increase as taxable values increase and as debt continues to go down, and it's based on GO debt. So as the debts continue to pay down and property taxes go up, your margin, that cushion, if you will, increases. So just keep that in mind as we go to the next slide where the graph shows. But this is for 2020, where you can see the assessed value of property taxes here at 2.5% would put you at, you know, you can borrow up to this much of GO debt. And our GO debt at 2020 was 4.5 million. So you can kind of see where that margin kind of plays out. And then from here, this is where the percentage lies at 2020. So what I'd like to do is kind of share the statistical page of the CAFR, where over the last few years, you can kind of see the trends here. Hopefully this is magnified enough for you, but you can kind of see as the taxable value goes along the top here, and then the 2.5%, the total debt that's applicable to the limit gives you the legal debt margin, and then the percentage from there is capped, or they're shown here, calculated is the word I'm looking for. So you can see here for 2020, that's at 1.86%, and it fluctuates, again, just based on that taxable value and the level of the GO debt, if that makes sense. And in terms of the financial information, that's pretty much all I have for that. So before I move into the communications that we're required to do under auditing standards, I'd like to open it up to any questions that you might have in terms of audit procedures or anything like that.
Thanks, Jan. Are there any questions over the sections that she just covered? And I have to say it's fascinating. In my 6th year on council, we've been looking at the debt margin this entire time, and it just continues to decrease, which is great. I think it puts us in a really good position. I'm happy with that. Any questions? I'm not seeing anyone raising their hands, so why don't you continue on, Jan? Thanks. Oh,
Great. Okay.
hang on, I just got somebody. Hang on. Brian, sorry. There's a little bit of a lag time with people figuring it out. Anyway, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's not a question. I just want to thank Jan for the thorough explanation on the debt margin. She, I'm sure, remembers this is always an area of sort of emphasis for me my entire time on council, and I appreciate the clear communication and the graph with it.
Great, thank you. Okay, go ahead, Jan.
Okay, thanks. So as part of our auditing standards, we're also required to talk about specific items that we are required to communicate to those charged with governance, which is this committee. So we talk about, in our engagement letter, we outline what our auditor responsibilities are. We also talk about the plan, scope, and timing in our engagement letter, and we talk about that during discussions with management when we're doing the planning for the audit itself. We are required to talk about any accounting policies that may have changed during the year, and this year, for the first time in a long time, there were no new accounting standards that were adopted. Now, I can't say that's going to be the case for, going forward forever, but it seems like we've just been hit with a ton of different accounting standards over the last several years that have significantly affected how the presentation of the report is put together. And so this year we got a bit of a reprieve from that. We are required to talk about significant audit findings, and what we talk about there is more, we talk about significant estimates that might be present in the financial statements, any sensitive disclosures, what the profession calls sensitive or important disclosures, and typically what we talk about there is the pension liability and the OPEB liability. Those are all based on actuarial findings, so there's significant estimates that are inherent in there. But we look at actuary reports, we look at the audit reports for the pension piece from the state, and we always determine whether or not that the way that they're presented on the city's financial statements are reasonable in relation to what we look at for underlying support, and we don't find any issues there. There were no difficulties in performing the audit. Again, it was a remote audit, but I think for the first time remote, it went pretty smoothly. So, who knows what the way of the world is going to be going forward. It may look a little different in terms of, a mixture of remote versus on-site, or it may just continue as is. It just depends on how that looks for staff and everybody else. There were no uncorrected misstatements for the financial statements. We also have, we look at other supplementary information as part of the CAFR and the overall audit procedures. We tie what we can to underlying supporting documentation. We determine that there's no changes in the method or presentation from the prior year, and we report on that as well. There were no disagreements with management. We do require management representations in the form of a letter that's just very specific boilerplate representations that were required to obtain from management as part of the issuance of the report. There were no consultations with other accountants, and what that means is, there's times when if there's a disagreement about an issue or something, parties might seek other opinions with other accountants, but this did not happen to our knowledge this year or in prior years, to be honest with you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the component units. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the city's CAFR does include the activities of its separate component units, and with these two particular component units, we do a separate audit for those. And so we do separate field work, separate procedures, separate testing, separate reporting. And we issued reports on those entities with an unmodified or clean opinion on both, and no findings at all related to internal control over financial reporting and no compliance findings. Now, those two are not subject to single audit just because they don't get federal funding, but they are subject to our government auditing standards. And so we have two separate reports that we issue as part of that. One on the financial statement level and then one for the government on we call it the Yellow Book report, but it's just two separate reports, but no issues there whatsoever. And then we also have the Business Improvement District, which, you know, again, is a discretely presented component unit, has its own column in the CAFR on the Statement of Net Position and the Statement of Activities. But we don't issue separate reports or a separate report for this. We just do our procedures as part of the overall city testing. And we have, you know, no issues there. We had no internal control findings on the Business Improvement District or on the TBID. So same kind of situation there. No separate report issued. It's presented as its own column in the CAFR. No internal control findings. Okay, so let's see. Now, as I said before, this year we were kind of lucky in that there was a number of accounting standards that were supposed to be effective for this particular year end. But with COVID, they were gracious enough to delay a lot of these. Now, some of these aren't going to have, you know, a significant effect on what we're doing in terms of accounting, if you will. Some of these are just, you know, matters of like reporting, or the format of our report's going to look a little bit different. We have the ability, if we're engaged, to report on what they're calling CAM, or key audit matters. That's just basically really very similar to what MD&A is, but we would be able to put that in our report instead of having management do it, you know, separately in the MD&A. And then there's also some other additional accounting standards that are going to be applicable in the upcoming years, and I think this will be applicable for fiscal year 22 for the city. And then the biggest one that will affect accounting, we've been talking about this one for several years. This one was also delayed. It has been delayed for, you know, several years. Over the last several years, it's been delayed here and there. But leases will be required to, you know, be implemented. The standard just simply changes the way that leases are going to be recorded on the balance sheet. So there's a lot of upfront work that we've been in talk with Lee about over the past several years. So I think, you know, we'll continue to be in contact with her about that. And with that, that's my presentation. Does anybody have any other questions or comments?
Great, thank you so much, Jan. First off, Lee, could I just request that you post this because I think it's always helpful to the public. Second quick item of business, I am not sure if this meeting goes until 1:15 or 1 o'clock. There's some confusion on the agenda, and I know that Ms. Becerra is going to try and contact staff regarding that. So in the meantime, we'll take questions. Let me see what we have. Ms. Hart.
Thanks, Gwen. Jan and Lee, you know, I really appreciate this presentation each and every year. And it feels like the last couple of years we've had these really great, clean opinions coming from the auditor, which I guess as one who's often heralded the idea of transparency and trust in government, I think it's really critical that we have clean opinions. And in my role at Habitat, I really very much understand the gravity of having an opinion that is clean and sends the message that we are being transparent even in a nonprofit world. But when we look at history, can you give us a little background and context, if you will? In terms of our auditing experience, have we always had a clean bill of health, if you will, or have we had some issues in the past that we've had to create those internal controls to remedy perhaps an adverse opinion?
Yeah, we've never, yeah, great question, because there's some clarity that needs to happen around what the overall opinion is versus what opinions on internal control and major programs would be. So in my history with the city, which has been quite a few years now, I mean, I started out doing staff work for the city on the audit several years ago. So I've been involved in this on all different facets, but there's never been what you would call a qualified overall opinion or an adverse opinion or a disclaimer of opinion. In other words, we've been able to support the numbers that go into the financial statements that enable us to provide a clean opinion, an unmodified opinion on the overall financial statements. Now, when we look at certain programs, federal programs, there might be some internal control issues that come out of that. There might be some compliance issues that come out of that. We've had those in the past, but that has not led to, you know, again, an effect on the overall financial statement opinion. Internal control issues can come in a number of different ways. Sometimes that comes just through, you know, some little recommendations that might strengthen internal control. Sometimes it's a little bit more evident that more work has to be done. So in the past, we've had some financial reporting findings, if you will, that have elevated to the overall report. But again, it doesn't affect that overall opinion. I don't know if that helped.
One thing I'd like to note also is that Anderson Zermulin at the end of every audit actually writes us a letter to the administration and the finance department, sort of outlining just some areas that the finance department can shore up. And that's actually something that we have utilized every year. And it's really enabled us to shore up some of those internal controls and our processes and procedures. And we always thank them for that helpful information.
And then just
But to know, we didn't have one this year. There wasn't one this year. So.
So we actually, it looks like we are supposed to stop at 1 o'clock. We are over time. I'm going to quickly call for public comment. I am not seeing any raised hands there. Thanks, Jan. You know, this is a little bit boring and uneventful, and that's great. That's exactly what we want. A smooth audit. So that's good. I would say I'm going to call on Brian just for one last question or comment. If people do have follow-up questions, please submit them because this is good. But Mr. Von Lossberg, go ahead.
It's very good. Thanks for that history, Jan. It completely squares with my recollection over the last 8 years of doing this. And I wanted to recognize Lee for her good work in this, and all of the staff in the city when it comes to this, and Dale as well. So, but I think Lee deserves some real recognition here, and I wanted to make sure that that's on the record.
Thanks for saying that. I appreciate it and completely agree. Thank you, Jan and Lee. We will adjourn this meeting so that we can get public work started on time. And thanks for the good news today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for being patient.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.